And for more on this, Internet Plus, that's quite a significant phrase these days in China. We are joined by Mr. Andy Mok, who is in Beijing and also the founder and president of Red Pagoda Resources. You probably need to help us to understand what's the secrets in the pagoda about the Internet Plus. And also in Beijing, we have Mr. Rob Kapp, who is the author of the book Clusters of Creativity, where those clusters are and where the creativity comes from. Gentlemen, first of all, I really need to let the two of you to explain, especially to our international viewers, about this phrase, Internet Plus, because this is such a buzzword in China. Mr. Kapp, what is your interpretation?
Well, I think in the US or in Western world generally, we would call this the Internet of Things. In China, it seems to mean a little bit more trying to get China modernized through the Internet. Thus the plus connotation.
How much will China be, Mr. Mok, modernized, quote unquote, if I'm using the interpretation of Mr. Kapp, by the Internet, given the current economic realities?
Well, I think the economic potential for China is enormous. And just to give you a little bit of background on this, so if you think about the number of potential internet connections, there's something called IPv4. So when the internet started, we had 4.6 billion potential addresses, or think of them as phone numbers. The new IPv6 has 340 unidecillion addresses, and that means trillion, trillion, trillion. And to just get a sense of the size, if we think of IPv4 with 4.3 billion addresses as the size of a postage stamp,
all right,
the new one will be the size of the solar system.
But you are only telling us about these numbers. The thing is whether the number will have a real impact on the economy, or actually we're talking about certain wealth created traditionally by the manufacturing sector now is likely to be created by the quote-unquote Internet Plus related industries. Will that be much increase? That's the question. Mr. Mok, I know you're in the internet industry, therefore you're all for this, but you really need to tell us what's really going to happen.
Yeah, well, I think it will be, because if we look at this, the other way of thinking about Internet Plus, or the Internet of Everything, or the Internet of Things, is the integration of bits and atoms. So if we look at everything from 3D printing to drones to robotics, that's going to have an enormous impact on the real economy.
Okay, here's the thing, Mr. Kapp. You're an economist yourself. You know that the Chinese economy is experiencing this transition from the earlier export manufacturing, low-end manufacturing to now looking at the high-end. How long will it take for some of the factors Mr. Mok just mentioned, 3D printing, robotics, these kind of things would have a real impact in terms of number on the Chinese economy?
Well, they already are. If you look at things like e-commerce and even going a step further, m-commerce, China has something like 85% of transactions done in the space we call e-commerce in the West actually over mobile devices, really phones, smartphones. That in the US, the numbers are like half of that. So, China's already leaped ahead in some ways, and it's stimulating retail and consumer spending.
Stimulating to what extent? That's what I really want to know, because are we really transferring money from the motor and bricks industries now to the internet? How much increase? That's what needs to be known.
I don't have the exact figures at the top.
You cannot have, right?
Right in my hands. Well, they are out there, but I mean, you would actually look at different segments, I think. So you see things like those sorts of industries, or more really actually entrepreneurs who couldn't afford rent at a typical shopping mall now can go online. That's one of the revolutions created by Taobao. That's why Alibaba was so, Alibaba, if you want to put some numbers behind it, the most successful IPO in the history of the world by a Chinese company on the New York Stock Exchange. So, this is an example of how that retail, e-commerce, m-commerce power has translated into real economic output for China and for the world, actually.
E-commerce, if we're talking about Internet Plus, is one of those forms, but it did not come without a price. We understand there are lawsuits going on about the patents, about intellectual property, about the counterfeiting. These are the news that we're hearing every day. Whether it is fair or not to start those cases against Chinese companies is one thing, but certainly that also shows the other side of the so-called Internet Plus, that you have to face a lot of different challenges which you wouldn't face earlier without this specific concept going into every details of the economy. Mr. Mok.
No, I think that's absolutely correct, but every industry goes through growing pains, And if you look at, for instance, Xiaomi expanding globally, they ran into some patent issues as well. But every company, I think, expanding abroad will face those problems, and they're unavoidable. But I think that doesn't detract from the opportunity that Internet Plus does present.
It's interesting that all of you, both of you, in fact, mentioned just a few names. For example, Xiaomi, for example, Alibaba, or some of the other Lenovo related to the Internet.
Right.
But if you think about the traditional economy, there are so many names that you could mention. Right. So that's the concern people have. Will this Internet Plus, the Chinese Premier has been working so hard for, have its blossom everywhere? That's the issue.
For those companies that dare to integrate and try to meet the challenge, because it is a challenge. If you're going to be an old style industry, you're not willing to compete online through e-commerce, through other means. I mean, great examples by Andy there. 3D printing now. Anyone can be a manufacturer. So if you're not a lean manufacturer, you're going to be unprofitable and uncompetitive manufacturer. So it's a challenge across the board, but if you're up to the challenge, you can do very well.
And I think it's important to note that from a national or public policy perspective, it is largely positive. People will lose their jobs, companies will go out of business. But that is more at the corporate level, and can an individual corporation make that transition, whether from desktop to mobile or from traditional e-commerce to mobile commerce, remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen. What do you think are the major factors that would influence the transition, whether it's going to be done or not successfully, or actually with a huge growing pain?
I think, of course, at the corporate level, it will be how courageous companies are to be willing to cannibalize their existing businesses.
What's your judgment, generally speaking?
So the companies that we deal with, mostly foreign companies, but some Chinese entities as well, including SOEs, have been incredibly proactive, setting up innovation units or labs or angel investment funds to make sure that they have a window on these new developments. Now, whether they'll be able to take advantage of them or not, we'll see, but at least it looks like they're taking a step in the right direction.
Looks like, your judgment?
I again think it depends on the nature of the company, the industry. You see some industries rising to the challenge more quickly. I think a lot of disruption we're going to see in areas like automobiles, because we're talking now about driverless cars. All the major IT players are looking at getting involved with that. And it's interesting, it's bringing together online entertainment, the search engines like Google, like Baidu, e-commerce providers like Alibaba, all are getting into this driverless car phenomena. So, what are the auto manufacturers going to be doing in response? All of those questions are being posed, and so it really depends on the nature of the industry and the nature of the companies, but tremendous opportunities.
It also has a lot to do with the nature of the kinds of creativity China is now embracing. You have this book, you talk about clusters of creativities.
Right.
Where is China's, or where are China's clusters of creativities, and how can we describe these type of creativity? Is it really like what is going on in the United States West Coast? We see these kinds of comparisons that the Chinese provinces would like to advocate about themselves, saying we're creating China's own in a way. So what do you think is the nature of this creativity going on in this country?
Right now it seems to be mainly, this is a somewhat crude description, but process creativity, process innovation. It's not so much fundamental what we'd call, the next big thing type of innovation, but it's an improvement. So, again, we've talked about Alibaba. Alibaba is kind of being an improvement on eBay or Amazon, perhaps. Baidu is being an improvement on Google within a Chinese context. We haven't yet seen fundamental new ideas out of China. That might be the next step.
All right. Is it really going to be the next step? That's the question.
Well, I think it is, because we look at the U.S. example of, how did the internet come about? It was through government financing, specifically by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. So we look similarly now, the Chinese government is investing a lot of basic R&D in the Internet of Things, or Internet Plus. So, and we also see the time frames for new technology adoption shrinking by every new technology. So I think it really is a matter of time, and it'll probably happen sooner than we expect.
A matter of time, that's exactly the issue, isn't it? The timing is very important, especially if you have the Chinese economy doing this transition and hoping Internet Plus will bring some new vitalities into the economy. Having said that, I would like to do this comparison. people have been having this discussion in China very intensely. Let's say, what is going on in China? How does it compare to the rest of the world? Yeah. One of the things people say, well, it is only quote unquote internet plus in China, but in the United States, for example, some of the other clusters of creativity, it is already the new hardwares. Right. So how can we compare these two stages? Where does that bring China's economy to, Mr. Cap?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you look at something like Apple, there's Xiaomi, but Apple is still really the leader, or Samsung. And Xiaomi is up and coming and providing an interesting product for this other segment, typically developing world market, but it's not yet at the level of an Apple, but people are hoping it will be. So yes, indeed, it does seem to still be the US leads in a lot of these technologies. We have yet to see a genuinely Chinese hardware type innovation or new great thing that everyone wants to have worldwide. However, that could be possible. If Xiaomi could overtake Apple. I mean, Apple with the iPhone overtook BlackBerry. BlackBerry used to be really, well, it was the pioneer of the smartphone, and now iPhone dominates that space. Xiaomi could be next.
And what do you think, hardware versus Internet Plus?
Well, I think hardware is an integral part of Internet Plus. But then when we look in Shenzhen, right, there's such a well-developed ecosystem for consumer electronics. And that reduces the cycle time and the experience curve. So I think it really is, the advantage does lie in China for hardware. The other thing I think it's important to know too, that a number of the fastest supercomputers in the world today are actually Chinese.
Right. Interesting point over there. Before we go, one important question I really need to mention. Some of you touched on it, but new industry coming in, new version of the economy, means some of the old version might be losing its charm. It means also loss of jobs. According to McKinsey, for example, real estate is in a way suffering in China. Stores are closing as well. And 31 million traditional jobs likely to be lost. I don't know whether that's really going to be the number. That certainly showcases the social challenge that this country might be facing. I mean, Internet Plus is being created, this concept to aid the economy, to create jobs, but when things like that happen, how can we keep that balance?
WeChat alone claims to have created 10 million jobs. So that compared, let's just assume those figures are correct, 31 million jobs across the board for all internet related influences. Well, a single social media platform has made up a third of that on its own, according to that company.
But how many WeChat can you invent within a year, right?
Well, but there is, there's also Weibo. There's a lot of these other social media platforms.
Right.
Alipay now, it's revolutionizing finance to be able to do mobile finance and peer-to-peer finance. It's all part of Internet Plus as well. So if you were to put it all together, I'm sure it would exceed by reliable statistics that 31 million figure.
Mr. Mark, are you as confident?
Yes and no, because I think, first of all, there will be economic dislocations, and it perhaps is more of a global phenomenon, because we look at things like robotics and AI that are now eliminating white-collar jobs in places like the US and Europe, and we're going to see that same thing here in China. But on the positive side, I think if we look at the One Belt, One Road initiative and the creation of a kind of Eurasian integrated market, that will provide enormous opportunities, I think, for Chinese entrepreneurs, and perhaps a redistribution of labor to growth industries and more export-oriented businesses that will have a large internet component to them.